Hello and thank you for returning to the Rogues Gallery. This is Schizofenik and I finally managed to produce a video on one of my earliest and favourite franchises of all time. As a child of the 80s, Ghostbusters was something that I was obsessed with, and I've been meaning to make a video on this subject for ages. However, with the recent release of Ghostbusters Afterlife, I feel that now is as good a time as any. As always, I will discuss a range of villains whilst exhibiting my favourite artwork for each character. Ironically, we will begin the Ghostbusters Rogues Gallery with an enemy that is not actually a ghost, but rather a man who tried to summon them. Surgeon and mythological science enthusiast Dr. Ivo Shandor was born in Romania at around 1855. This sadistic doctor was known for performing unnecessary operations and horrific experiments on his patients, like giving a man 2 hearts. Eventually, Shandor became obsessed with the beliefs of the cult of Gozer and moved to New York in 1898, where he pursued architecture. It was here that he designed and built the apartment tower at 55 Central Park West that housed the Temple of Gozer. Shandor dedicated himself to summoning the apocalypse upon the rooftop of his temple, but died in 1934 when an experimental surgery on himself went wrong. Although catching a cab in New York is incredibly difficult, you would probably be glad that you missed this one, because it is driven by our first class-free apparition known as the Driver. This zombie-like entity manifests within various taxicabs across Madison Avenue before taking control of the vehicle and terrifying its unsuspecting passengers in a joyride from hell. This ghost was possibly the victim of a fatal accident that resulted in the driver crashing into the Harlem River during the 1950s. Anyone who has encountered this spectre has had to endure looking at its horrific appearance while smelling the hideous stench of its rotting flesh. The next class-free spectre on our tour is a real parasite, especially if you're a vulnerable child. This parasitic being only exists to produce more of its own kind and actually targets children into committing sinful acts. Upon receiving the child's willful permission, the entity known as Grundle bonds with its victim before feeding on their soul whilst implanting its own abhorrent essence. As a result, the child performs acts of evil and eventually becomes the new Grundle in this self-perpetuating process. The Ghostbusters have faced this foe on several occasions and have discovered that the entity cannot be trapped whilst linked to a child. Positively charged psychomagnetheric slime is what is needed for separation. We up the ante as we approach the Class 4 entities within the gallery and take a look at the very first spectre that the founding members of the Ghostbusters faced together. After her disappearance in 1924, the head librarian Eleanor Twitty re-emerged as a ghost that haunted New York's public library. Members would feel as if they were being watched and were even shushed by an unseen presence if they spoke too loudly. However, in 1929, the hauntings ceased until they manifested again years later within the lower levels of the library. This time the spectre would leave ectoplasmic discharge and became more aggressive in its interactions with the librarians and patrons within the establishment. This ghost could transform into a more terrifying form and emit a spine-chilling scream when threatened. The rather unprepared Ghostbusters would experience this firsthand when they tried to get her. Eventually, the Ghostbusters, armed with their proton packs, would capture this ghost when they met again in the secret crypt beneath the library. Our next ghostly lady is one that you might not mind having a close encounter with. She is of course the woman of Ray Stan's dreams. New York's Fort Des Mering is home to a dream ghost that manifests in the presence of a sleeping individual. This entity was said to be the lover of an officer at the fort when it was operating as a military base. It is believed that those who frequent the rooms that this entity visits are met with extreme fatigue and fall into a deep sleep. It is here that the dream ghost graces you with its presence. Our next female spectre is something you would expect to see in a horrific nightmare because she is a real witch. The 17th century witch known as the Kestrel was burnt at the stake during the Salem trials. Despite being guilty as charged, she swore to extract vengeance from beyond the grave. In 1989, the Kestrel would take advantage of a televised seance to transport her spirit back to Earth. The witch would use host Morgan Crom's body to house its spirit, morphing the form to meet her own original appearance. The Kestrel used her airtime to threaten revenge on the viewers, then began to psychokinetically attack the town and even burnt down the Salem Witch Museum. This witch was so powerful that the Ghostbusters had to adapt one of their traps to remove the Kestrel from its host body before capturing her with the proton stream. There must be something fishy going on when the diners in a seafood restaurant witness a fish devour the owner. However, this is exactly what happens at Sargassi's. When Enzo Papi Sargassi, the founder of the Sargassi seafood restaurant, was lost at sea, he reappeared approximately 2 decades later as a spectre in the establishment. He would most frequently appear in the branch at the Cedric Hotel lobby, where he would end up as dinner for a ghostly shark that would chase and devour him. The Ghostbusters would successfully trap Sargassi by securing the more aggressive shark-like entity first. In keeping with our Class 4 entities, we will move on to a gruesome twosome that we first witnessed in Ghostbusters 2. After being convicted of murder, Nunzio and Tony Scalari were sentenced to death in the electric chair by Judge Stephen Wexler. The Scalari brothers would reappear years later in front of the Ghostbusters, who were being charged by Wexler for investigating the supernatural and damaging public property. During this trial, Judge Wexler's furious reactions would negatively react with the slime that the Ghostbusters collected. This caused the Scalari brothers to re-emerge and fly around the courtroom within the chairs that they were electrocuted in. Now with full elemental control of electricity, they would terrorize the very judge that sentenced them years ago. Luckily for Wexler, the Ghostbusters would trap the Scalaris after the charges against them were dropped. We will stick with the Ghostbusters 2 as we move on to a photogenic villain that truly belongs in the Rogues Gallery. The merciless tyrant Prince Vigo of Carpathia came into power in the 1400s, ruling over his homeland and the conquered country of Moldavia with an iron fist. However, when his oppression became intolerable, the people would rise against him as they poisoned, shot, stabbed and hanged him before he was drawn and quartered. Despite this, the 105-year-old Vigo clung to life and even threatened vengeance before finally succumbing to his injuries after hanging for days. The superstitious people would eventually behead and cremate Vigo to avoid his spiritual return. Unfortunately, the Ghostbusters would encounter Vigo centuries later, initially in portraits form within the Manhattan Museum of Art. Vigo would attempt to rise again by feeding off the negative energy from the mood slime that was flowing through New York's abandoned subway tunnels. Vigo would blackmail Janos Poha, the museum's head of restorations, into kidnapping Dana Barrett's infant son so he could return to Earth in physical form. When this plan failed, Vigo possessed Ray Stans, who had to be exorcised with a positively charged mood slime. Once separated from Ray, the Ghostbusters would blast Vigo back into the painting with their proton streams. We move from one tyrannical Class 4 entity to the next, with the living god known as Dumasu. This tyrannical ruler was so feared by his subjects that they worshipped him as a living god. When he finally died almost after 130 years of life, he promised to one day return and create a dystopian world for his followers. Dumasu's body was buried in a cavern below Manhattan and lay dormant until his spirit began to manifest in the dreams of his direct descendants. These nightmarish visions would feature Dumasu as a beast-faced demon calling out for the relic of Nile, a blue crystal orb. Eventually one of his descendants obliged him and unearthed the artifact whilst on an excavation in Rhode Island. Dumasu's spirit would later try to reclaim it in the Museum of Natural History, where it was being exhibited. Dumasu later merged with various exhibits from the museum into a makeshift body as it attempted its manifestation. Ultimately, the Ghostbusters were forced to fire concentrated proton blasts to shatter the relic of Nilhe, causing Dumasu to disperse. The Ghostbusters Rogues Gallery returns after these messages. Welcome back to the Rogues Gallery of the Ghostbusters. If you ain't afraid of no ghost, then you can stay with me as we move on to our Class 5 enemies, and we shall begin with a true fan favourite, even if he is an ugly little spud. This gluttonous ghoul haunted the Sedgwick Hotel since the 1920s and was the first spectre that the Ghostbusters tested their equipment on. The green ghost presence would thicken the air as well as leave the lingering stench of rancid meat. Dr. Ventman was unfortunate enough to experience his grotesque qualities firsthand when he was slimed by the entity. This ectoplasmic incident would result in the Ghostbusters calling it Slimer, which is a name that has really stuck. It is believed that Slimer originates from the apocalyptic cult of Gozer, who held meetings at the Sedgwick Hotel during the 1920s. During these sessions, the cult may have conjured a hungry spirit whose appetites cannot be satiated. Despite constantly gorging on food, the devoured contents would simply pass through the ghost, forever leaving it hungry in this vicious cycle of gluttony. Slimer has since become one of the most popular ghosts in the franchise and has even served as a mascot for the group in the real Ghostbusters. Much like Slimer, our final Class 5 Spectre also enjoys a good munch, as we all saw in Ghostbusters Afterlife. The one known as Muncher made its on-screen debut in the 2021 blockbuster Ghostbusters Afterlife. This ghost left drool-like blue ectoplasm on anything it had bitten and was named by Phoebe for literally munching on metal. This Class 5 free-floating Spectre was first seen making a meal out of metallic objects in the Somerville Foundry and was possibly created as a homage to Slimer. Despite its rather innocuous appearance, it could spit metallic projectiles at its pursuers, but was ultimately caught by Phoebe and Podcast just before it reached the Shandor Mining Company. Our next collection of ghouls in the gallery are all Class 6 entities, but we shall begin with a group of ghosts called the Collectors. The relentless demons known as the Collectors will permanently abduct the target of anyone who summons them in exchange for their sanity. The Ghostbusters became the target of these beings when the demon Idilmus possessed Janosch Poha, who sent the Collectors after them. As a result, the Ghostbusters were lost within an interdimensional limbo. Despite being trapped for a few hours, months had passed in the real world, and the Ghostbusters only managed to return when they rewired a proton pack to explode. It was later revealed that Idilmus possessed Janosch in an attempt to trick the Collectors into taking its host's sanity instead of his own. This, however, did not work, and the Collectors removed the demon from Janosch and took it to their own plane of existence. It really is like cats and dogs living together as we take a special look at a couple of Class 6 animal spirits like the one known as Apshai. This large mantis-like demon defied the sun god Ra and escaped the Egyptian underworld to return to the land of the living. Once here, Apshai would avoid Ra's sunlight and recruited its followers in the dark of night in order to return the planet to the insects. At this time, the Ghostbusters were called in to investigate supernatural insectoid activity, where they discovered Apshai within an abandoned subway station. The Ghostbusters subsequently learnt of Apshai's aversion to direct sunlight and destroyed the ceiling of the subway, letting in sunlight which combusted its physical form. From a large mantis to a gigantic whale, we will take a look at all creatures great and small. However, they do not come much bigger than Lotan, the harbinger of catastrophic destruction. This serpentine whale has swum through the sky for millennia, causing mass devastation which included the destruction of Atlantis. Lotan would surface again during other disasters such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the Blitz in London, and the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. It is believed that this whale acts as a bad omen and is attracted to potent psychokinetic energy. Lotan was witnessed by the Ghostbusters above New York's Museum of Natural History as they battled Dumasu. However, when the Ghostbusters defeated Dumasu avoiding catastrophe, Lotan would become irate as it knocked into buildings, damaging the Chrysler Building. In order to overcome their enormous enemy, the Ghostbusters would rig an unmanned aerial vehicle with proton explosives, which they flew straight into the whale's mouth, causing an explosion that dispersed the entity. Before we head over to our Class 7 heavyweights, we will take a quick look at an unclassifiable being. Katulu is an entity whose existence cannot be identified, however it is its psychic influence that is threatening. This being would attempt to form a cult by encouraging followers to summon it into existence, where it would possess their bodies as miniature versions of itself. Its eventual existence manifested as an enormous demigod within Coney Island, where it caused lightning storms. The Ghostbusters managed to return this being into its dormant state by attracting a lightning strike to a roller coaster before ionizing the track with their proton streams, giving it a shock of 100 gigavolts. We now return to the Ghostbusters Rogues Gallery. If you are brave enough to continue the tour, we will be seeing stuff that will turn you white with fear. The final section of the gallery looks at the hugely powerful Class 7 entities that the Ghostbusters have had the misfortune of facing. The demon known as Rael initially manifested in sub-Saharan Africa approximately 3,000 years ago and is known to influence animals by way of possession. Regarding the beasts as his children, Rael would become enraged by mankind's cruelty to the creatures of Earth and destroyed any game hunters as a result. Eventually, Rael was entrapped within a statue of itself and was presented to Julius Caesar by Cleopatra. Years later, the statue would find its way to the American Museum of Natural History, where it escaped its statue form and anthropomorphized the animals of New York City. Together these beasts would share in Rael's hatred of mankind and wreaked havoc across the streets until the Ghostbusters trapped Rael by playing a tone at 40 kHz, which weakened the entity. Our next two entities are the stuff of nightmares, as they have haunted the subconscious of generations through folklore tales. This horrific nocturnal entity from folklore was infamous for removing the eyes of its victims whilst they dreamed of a cloaked man throwing sand in their eyes whilst carrying an hourglass. When the Ghostbusters arrived in Staten Island to investigate an incident, they too became induced by the entity's lucid dream state. Eventually, the Ghostbusters defeated the being by imagining their proton equipment and destroyed its hourglass totem, which caused the entity to dissipate. The next entry will keep you awake at night too afraid to sleep because he is the infamous Boogeyman. This infamous monster from folklore is well known for entering a child's bedroom via a closet or from under the bed before carrying them away in its sack at night. Originally, this entity was rumoured to be a monk driven to insanity by the local children's poor behaviour. As a result, Roddy Fairy sold his soul to the devil in exchange for his cloak of invisibility, as well as the power to appear as what terrified his child victims the most. Now known as the Boogeyman, Roddy Fairy would use his powers to sacrifice the naughtiest children. With fear being the source of his powers, the Boogeyman appeared in Times Square during the New Year's Eve celebration in order to frighten the crowd and feed on their terror. This being became so powerful that the Ghostbusters had to utilise 2 traps to capture him. Our next series of Class 7 villains are electrically powered in some form, so let's begin with Lilith. The entity known as Lilith fed on living beings by consuming bioelectricity. However, when modern society became more dependent on the energy, she no longer required living victims. Instead, Lilith found greater sustenance in the form of electrical technology and was first encountered by the Ghostbusters at a generating station. When the Ghostbusters switched off her power supply, Lilith became more voracious, reverting back to attacking the living for electricity. The team would have to utilise Boston darts to drive her away before luring her back to the firehouse with a frequency that matched her own PKE signature. Once there, the Ghostbusters would trap her while she was distracted by the generators that powered the ecto-containment unit. Our second electrically charged villain really puts the killer in Kilowatt. This highly evolved elemental entity can manipulate electricity and possess almost anything that runs on an electrical current. Further to this, Kilowatt can even discharge smaller clones of itself that obey its nefarious commands. After causing a plethora of power cuts throughout New York City, Kilowatt battled the Ghostbusters, who disrupted the power across Manhattan, Queens and Brooklyn in an attempt to trap the entity. This ultimately caused Kilowatt to lose its potency, allowing the Ghostbusters to dissipate its clones and trap the entity. From Kilowatt to plain old Watt, we will take a look at a demon that first appeared in one of my favourite Real Ghostbusters episodes of all time, Mrs. Rogers' Neighbourhood. The demon known as Watt is a dominating force of the underworld that will utilise its host body to gain world domination and biblical Armageddon. The Ghostbusters first encountered this being in its latest manifestation as Mrs. Rogers, a frail old lady who hired the team to investigate the hauntings within her house. Upon their arrival, Watt, as the old lady, asked for sanctuary within the Ghostbusters headquarters, where it intended to release the ghosts within the containment unit. This was Watt's cunning plan all along, as it wished to utilise an army of ghosts to subjugate mankind. Watt came close to achieving its terrifying goal, and even possessed Peter Venkman in the process before the Ghostbusters trapped the creature when it reverted to its true form. Another Class 7 demonic possessor is the entity named a Chira. The demon known as a Chira is responsible for spreading diseases such as the Black Death across the centuries. In order to do this, however, the entity must possess a willing host that is strong enough to supply its body. Its chosen victims are often those who helplessly desire revenge and are therefore more open to suggestion due to their impotent state. When possessed, the host adopts a horrific appearance and is deadly to anyone who tries to perform an exorcism. Winston Zedmore was integral to capturing this creature, as he used his former training as a Marine to fire darts with antibiotics at the host, which drove a Chira away. We all love a bit of trick or treat, but there's something strange in your neighbourhood if it's Halloween all year round. The Spirit King that adopts the alias of Samhain draws power from ghosts and is known for attempting to prolong the traditional festival of Samhain on the 31st of October. This period marks the coming of winter, a season when spirits have an easier time crossing into the living world. Extending autumn would ultimately allow Samhain to end all life, and his abilities have autumnal qualities as his presence reduces temperatures, turns day into night, and green leaves to brown. Samhain would summon lesser spirits to Central Park, where he would grow in strength through their presence. It was here that the Ghostbusters witnessed this entity's power, as it was impervious to proton streams, proton grenades, or Boston darts. Samhain was only captured once the Ghostbusters realised that he would grow weaker as they entrapped his surrounding spirits first. Now to one of the most famous high tops in cinematic history, as we move to arguably the Ghostbusters' greatest nemesis in Gozer. Worshipped by Mesopotamians and Hittites, Gozer, the Sumerian deity of death and destruction, was said to be the force that would bring the end of the world. However, a cult that worshipped Gozer's sibling Tiamat opposed the Gozerians' apocalyptic vision and banished the deity. Despite this, Gozer's followers remained loyal and were rewarded over 1,000 years later when their god emerged at the site of the temple upon 55 Central Park West. This building was designed to be a spiritual radio tower by Ivo Shandor and intended to broadcast prayers to Gozer. It was on this tower that Gozer battled with the Ghostbusters and demanded that they choose their destroyer. The Ghostbusters have clashed with this entity on several occasions, and although its physical essence has been dispersed, its conscience remains on Earth. Of course, Gozer cannot manifest without its trusted minions summoning him to the physical world, so let's segue to our next pair of corporeal possessors. These powerful members from a race of other dimensional bear-like creatures are minions to Gozer and precursors to the Destructor's arrival. Vince, Clotho and Zuul seek bodies to possess so that they can transform into the Keymaster and Gatekeeper who, once united, could bring about the coming of Gozer. Upon the summoning's completion, they transform into their true Terror Dog forms. Vince, Clotho and Zuul possess Dana Barrett and Louis Tully before possessing Callie Spengler and Gary Gruberson years later. In each case, the host would return unharmed to human form once Gozer was defeated. The next entity within the Ghostbusters Rogues Gallery is Gozer's lesser-known minion Idilmus. As the third minion of Gozer, Idilmus has similar possessive abilities to Vince, Clotho and Zuul that can manifest through mirrors and other reflective surfaces. Further to this, the entity known as Idilmus can weaponize electrical energy. Despite not being one of Gozer's original servants, it was willed into existence by the deity so that it could leave the marshmallow form and possess a more destructive body. As a result, Idilmus kidnapped Ray Stantz and tried to force him into selecting a more threatening form for Gozer. This plan was brought to a halt by the Ghostbusters, who rescued Ray and blasted the entity with a proton grenade. We stick with the Gozer family of entries by taking a special look at his sinister sister, Tiamat. Sister to Gozer, this Sumerian goddess of chaos opposed her brother, which caused a massive rivalry between their cults. Tiamat's love of chaos required life, which Gozer wanted to end, therefore she would direct her followers to banish Gozer from this plane of existence. The Gozerian temple would burn for 9 days under blood-red skies, whilst an abundance of catastrophes plagued the population. Gozer's subsequent return and destruction in New York caught Tiamat's attention as a deity arrived in the Big Apple to observe modern humanity and of course the Ghostbusters. Her arrival brought about scientific aberrations such as unreliable gravity and blood rain. After a battle with the Ghostbusters, Tiamat left this dimension of her own accord as she was pleased with the chaotic state of the world. Our final entity is also Gozer, but in a significantly less threatening form, the Staypuff Marshmallow Man. When Gozer surfaced in New York, the entity allowed the Ghostbusters to choose their destroyer, and a stray thought from Ray Stantz's memory brought about the gigantic Staypuff Marshmallow Man. Despite looking rather innocuous, the 100-foot piece of colossal confectionery proved to be incredibly destructive. However, within this form, the entity was immensely slow, which worked to the Ghostbusters' advantage. The team risked protonic reversal by crossing their proton streams whilst aiming them at the temple, which caused the Staypuff Marshmallow Man to melt away in dramatic fashion. In subsequent encounters, the Ghostbusters used a modified trap to capture a significant fraction of the Gozerian's essence, which drove it away. The threat of Staypuff does remain if there is enough psychokinetic energy to regenerate the being, even if it is to a less potent degree. This was hilariously witnessed in the recent Ghostbusters Afterlife movie, where the Marshmallow Man took the strength in numbers approach. That ends our tour of the Ghostbusters Rogues Gallery. I hope that I did not omit too many of your favourite spectres from this exhibition, but please feel free to list others in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the Rogues Gallery. Take care.